It's 1989. Iraq is awash in oil money. The economy is growing, and Saddam Hussein is at the helm of a rapidly developing nation. Following the Iraq-Iran war and after years of denying Kuwait's independence, Saddam Hussein begins making a series of accusations against its neighbour, first claiming that Kuwait is waging economic warfare against Iraq by overproducing oil, and later accusing Kuwait of stealing oil from the Rumalia oil field, an Iraqi oil field near the border of Iraq and Kuwait. Shortly after these accusations, Saddam sends more than 100,000 troops to invade Kuwait, and Emir Jaber al-Ahmad al-Sabah is forced to flee Saudi Arabia with his family and cabinet. This invasion receives strong condemnation from the United Nations, and US forces, along with its allies, descend upon Iraq, beginning Operation Desert Storm. However, sanctions, not military action, proved to be the most devastating force in this conflict. In one of the most comprehensive sanctioning efforts in modern history, the United Nations Security Council passes Resolution 661, cutting Iraq off from trading with the rest of the developed world, and preventing them from accruing any further wealth with their oil trade. The results are catastrophic. According to data from the World Bank, Iraq's GDP shrunk from $180.4 billion in 1990 to just $12.5 billion in 1995, and Iraq rapidly devolves from a developing economic powerhouse to a humanitarian crisis. By 1995, other nations were starting to become concerned that the sanctions may have overshot the mark. How was it possible for these sanctions to be so devastating? Many nations had warm relationships with Iraq, even immediately prior to the sanctions. Why did they go along with these sanctions? And how does a country lose more than 93% of its GDP in less than 5 years? To answer this question, let's take a closer look at 5 nations: Brazil, the Soviet Union, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. All these nations had positive relationships with Iraq, and none had reason to oppose Iraq's annexation of Kuwait. However, no one opposed the sanctions. If we look closely, we see that each of these developing nations were going through significant changes. China and India were beginning to see massive increases in their GDP as they opened their nations to trade with the West. The Soviet Union was attempting to rehabilitate its image with their trading partners. South Africa was still recovering from the stain of apartheid, and Brazil was still navigating hyperinflation and great economic uncertainty. The result was that Iraq had no allies to turn to. In 1990, to be sanctioned by the West was to face economic devastation. But is that the case today? To answer that question, let's look closely at Venezuela. In the 20th century, Venezuela's large oil reserves made it the most prosperous country in Latin America. Shortly after discovering oil in the 1930s, it became Venezuela's primary export. As oil prices increased, so did Venezuela's economy and standard of living. Under Hugo Chavez, this wealth was distributed among the population, with a large portion of the earnings being invested into education, healthcare, and various social programs. However, though profitable, having oil as Venezuela's primary export left the nation vulnerable to fluctuations in oil prices. In 2013, after the death of Hugo Chavez, his protege, Nicolas Maduro, was elected president. Shortly after, oil prices dropped sharply, and Venezuela's once strong economy took a nosedive. Despite the decrease in oil profits, Nicolas Maduro attempted to maintain stringent price controls and currency controls, leading to widespread shortages of essential goods. Moreover, in an attempt to manage deficits, the government began printing money at a rapid rate, creating rapidly escalating inflation. This led to La Salida, or the exit, a wave of Venezuelan protest against the sudden increase in crime and inflation. These protests resulted in several deaths, and soon Venezuela found itself in an extremely vulnerable position. Citizens began to flee the country, and there were reports of many extrajudicial killings at the hands of the Venezuelan Special Police Force. There were even reports of citizens being forced to rummage through garbage for food. In response, the government began to sanction and shut down any local media that were critical of the government. Maduro also began to abuse the power of the Supreme Court, filling it with members loyal to himself in order to override the other branches of government, and gave control over many sectors of the economy to the military. In response to Maduro's policies, in 2015 the United States began sanctioning Venezuelan officials, and in 2017 barred the country from borrowing from American creditors. However, the most impactful sanctions occurred in 2019, when the Trump administration placed the country under a total embargo, barring them from trading all resources, including oil, in the middle of the nation's most severe economic crisis. And yet, despite Venezuela's GDP dropping by 75% and the nation being at its lowest economic moment in history, it began to show signs of life, despite the West's stance and grave economic mismanagement. In 2022, the nation's economy finally grew for the first time in almost a decade, and the food shortages and hyperinflation saw an end. While Venezuela is far from being out of the woods, The nation appears to be steering itself out of the situation, despite the sanctions. What has changed? Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. These aforementioned nations essentially have extended a lifeline to Venezuela. Despite the West's sanctions, all 5 still traded with Venezuela, purchasing Venezuelan oil and selling goods to the nation, essentially undermining the West's sanctions. What changed? To get a glimpse of the future of geopolitics, let's first look at unipolarity and multipolarity. Many people feel that the world is a much more volatile place than it once was. While economics cannot completely answer why, it can give us a lens through which we can make sense of this recent increase in chaos. Specifically, we need to understand the concepts of unipolarity and multipolarity. In the wake of World War II, America's economy was able to secure itself as a dominant global force. In an effort to facilitate economic recovery, the Bretton Woods Conference was held in 1944 to develop a new international monetary system. In this conference, nations agreed to peg their currencies to the value of the dollar, and the dollar to the value of gold, in turn making the dollar the world's reserve currency. Because of how important the dollar became for global trade, nations kept cash reserves in US dollars in foreign central banks. This meant that nations could now trade between each other using the dollar. This helped facilitate trade and grew the economies of many nations. However, this global interconnectedness with the American economy gave the United States far-reaching economic influence. Rather than risk losing access to US markets and the financial systems, most foreign entities would comply with United States foreign policy to avoid the risk of sanctions. Because of the immense power of the dollar, in addition to the US's military might, the world was in lockstep with American policies, making the world a somewhat more predictable, stable place. However, as global trade enriched other countries, this began to change. The United States was not the only nation to benefit from global trade. In the midst of a major balance of payment crisis, India developed shrewd neoliberal economic policies to rebuild its economy. In 1991, Finance Minister Manmohan Singh passed multiple reforms, including reducing import tariffs and lessening the restrictions around business licensing, and opened many of its industries to foreign investment, especially its manufacturing and telecommunications sectors. As a result of these policies, companies rushed to do business with the nation. India's GDP grew from $619.6 billion to approximately $2.9 trillion in 2020, making it one of the most powerful, significant developing nations in the world. With this new economic importance, India pushed to grow its relationships with global powers while remaining neutral on affairs that did not serve the interests of Indian citizens. Russia and Brazil saw similar developments, with Russia's oil exports playing a large part in bringing its GDP from $516 billion to $1.47 trillion, despite the 2008 financial crisis and Western sanctions, and Brazil's agricultural industry and friendly Chinese ties bringing its GDP from $461 billion to over $2 trillion. The most impressive growth, of course, was seen by China. As businesses sought cheaper means of production to further boost their share prices, China became the world's manufacturer and became very rich as a result. Between 1990 and 2020, China's GDP grew by a staggering 357%, from $360.9 billion in 1990 to $14.34 trillion in 2020. With this growth in GDP, these nations developed greater economic power than they had in the past, and were now much less vulnerable than they had been in 1990. This economic resilience brought with it a national identity and agenda that was almost divorced from that of the West. While the staggering growth of these nations' economies did afford them certain powers, they still were not individually more powerful than the West. However, between the 4 of them, their large economies could provide much mutual benefit. Moreover, they might be able to further develop their power by providing a runway for nations that found themselves in similar positions as they did in the 1990s. In 2001, economist Jim O'Neill first coined the term BRIC to describe the staggering development of Brazil, Russia, India, and China, in a paper titled Building Better Economic BRICS. This paper noted the unbelievable growth all nations had witnessed, and forecasted that if combined, the economies could eclipse Western powers by 2050. In line with this prediction, Jim expressed in the paper that if G7 was to become a forum where true worldwide economic policy coordination was discussed, would be joined by China and India, rather than Italy and Canada, how correct he would prove to be. In 2006, the foreign ministers of Brazil, Russia, India, and China met in New York City at a UN assembly. This informal meeting was the first of many talks that culminated in an official assembly of powers in 2009 at their first formal summit in Russia. In this summit, they discussed ways to increase their economic might and to assist nations like themselves in achieving global power. This summit resulted in their first challenge, though understated, to the supremacy of the dollar, when the Russian President Dmitry Medvedev critiqued the dollar as a reserve currency. But it is quite obvious that the existing currency system has not coped with the existing challenges. We were lucky to have a set of currencies, dollar, euro, and a pound, but in the future this system should be based upon a multi-currency basket. It should also include other regional reserve currencies. It was a very subtle, harmless comment, at least on the surface, but it was clear that in the minds of these developing powers, the world did not have to remain as it currently was. Over the following decade, the group would make good on its aim towards greater economic cohesion, seeking to reduce their reliance on Western economic groups like IMF. They welcomed South Africa into the allegiance, and noting the IMF's negligence towards developing nations, they developed the New Development Bank, depositing $100 billion to build the bank's balance, funds they later used for infrastructure development within the BRICS nations, among other projects. This new development was great, but the question remained, just how powerful was this new allegiance? In 2020, Vladimir Putin launched a full-scale invasion of Ukraine to global condemnation. The United States stated that they would start at the top of the escalation ladder and stay there. Subsequently, they removed many of Russia's banks from the SWIFT system, thus cutting them off from communicating with the rest of the financial world, and barred many of them from accessing US dollar transactions. Additionally, many Western countries imposed sanctions that restricted Russian companies from accessing Western capital markets and obtaining certain Western technologies. Assets of specific Russian individuals and entities were frozen, and some trading venues delisted shares of Russian companies. The sale of specific oil refining technologies and certain airplane components to Russian companies was also restricted, and limitations were placed on the purchase of refined Russian fuels. The effects on the economy were, well, disputed. There were reports of rising inflation, unemployment, and shortages, and according to studies from various academic institutions, Russian businesses faced a bleak, uncertain future if the sanctions continued. However, by mid-2023, it became clear that the sanctions, while certainly impactful, were not resulting in the level of devastation that analysts had predicted. Russian GDP had only shrunk by 2.1%, a far cry from the 15% predicted by the USA. So what was going on? As the United States and European Union shut their doors to the Russian economy, India and China welcomed them with open arms. Oil trades between Russia and China grew by 44%, offering cushion against US sanctions. India too became a top consumer of Russian crude oil, and by selling refined fuels to Europe, they actually served as a vehicle to assist Russia in bypassing sanctions. Brazil became a major exporter of meat into Russia, selling literal tons of meat to the sanctioned nation. While Russia was still very much so economically entangled with the West, their geopolitical diversification was paying off. The growth of China's economy and the power of its yuan allowed Russia to lessen the impact of sanctions by using the yuan to pay for commodities instead of the dollar. India, in particular, used the earnings from its exports to China to pay for Russian oil in yuan, further assisting Russia in bypassing US sanctions. Despite America's attempts at dissuading them, India was firm in its commitment to trade with its BRICS partner. Russia also turned to other countries to import the supplies they need, turning to the UAE and Turkey for sanctioned products. The same sweeping sanctions that devastated Iraq in 1990 were harming but not devastating Russia, and signaled to the rest of the world just how beneficial a new financial allegiance could be for nations with foreign policy goals that ran contrary to those of the Western world. The rest of the developing world took notice of both the United States' actions against Russia and the efficacy of trade between developing nations in keeping Russia's dreams of Ukrainian annexation alive. In August 2023, BRICS formally extended invitations to 6 nations: Argentina, Egypt, Ethiopia, the United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, and Iran. With Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates representing 2 of the strongest economies in the Middle East, the power of BRICS appears to be increasing. And with a similarly sanctioned Iran joining the allegiance, it is becoming clear that rivals of the United States are taking notice of just how powerful the allegiance can be. And so we finally return to Venezuela. As of October 20th, 2023, the United States has lifted sanctions against Venezuela in exchange for Nicolas Maduro allowing an internationally monitored free election in the coming year. There are many reasons for this: a growing migrant crisis in the United States, and American companies having interests in the Venezuelan oil company, to name 2 of them. However, Caleb McCarry, the George W. Bush administration's Cuba transition coordinator and a senior professional staff member on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, said, "We are living in a different world, and this is exactly the kind of diplomacy that is needed to advance American interests abroad. It's 2023, not 1993. The Venezuelan economy, while still suffering tremendously from poor management and stringent sanctions, has not been entirely destroyed, thanks, at least in part, to assistance from BRICS, an allegiance seeking a world where the United States is not the primary obstacle to a nation's goals. Maduro may yet be able to achieve his goal of authoritarian rule. As time goes on, sanctioning may not be enough of a deterrent to remain the primary non-lethal tool in the American diplomacy arsenal. How stable will the world remain? If the dollar can no longer be a deterrent, what does that do to America's global influence? How does that impact nuclear proliferation? And how does it prevent further regional annexation? If you found this informative or entertaining, or hopefully both, please like and subscribe, and let us know your thoughts in the comments. Thanks for watching.